Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of our Foreign Correspondents Talk series. This is, of course, the 2025 edition. Happy New Year to anybody who's catching up with us only now. My name is Alan Herrera. I run editorial operations for the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, that is AFPC-USA. And while conducting this series, what I really love about it is that I have the opportunity to speak with foreign journalists, all kinds of journalists, and just get to know about their lives and experiences, and just living and working here and elsewhere. It's an honor for me, and today I have the opportunity to interview a wonderful, esteemed journalist. I have here with me Kiran Nazish. She is a Pakistani journalist, and she has worked as a foreign correspondent all around the world, including the Middle East and in South Asia. She founded and she is also the director of the Coalition for Women in Journalism, and it is a wonderful worldwide support organization for female journalists and so needed. And she's had just a remarkable career encompassing print journalism, television, radio, and she's won awards for her work, which has extensively covered conflicts and peace and security in South Asia and the Middle East. So I'm going to hand the floor over to her now, but Kiran, I'm very happy that you're here with me today, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with a pioneer for women journalists. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan, and Happy New Year to you too. I hope that this year is going to be happy, although we have to tread very carefully when we talk about press freedom and journalists in 2025. I can't help but start with a caution there. But I hope that we come out happily, as we were having this brief conversation earlier about you sharing some of your stuff. And I want to say what I got from your story is resilience. And so I wish that we have a resilient new year as we begin
I
this new year.
Yes, no, I appreciate that, and I wish the same for you and for anybody who is listening to us today and watching us. So, well, I will start off by saying, since we're on that note, right? The US right now is going through a very rocky time, to put it mildly. And we, as journalists, right, we know in leading the Fourth Estate, we know about these threats, right? This is not anything new to us. Many journalists around the world, right, they work in authoritarian regimes. They've had to flee them in order to continue reporting and to live their lives and conduct themselves freely. Can you tell me a bit more about how your organization is prepared to meet the challenges of the coming months and years?
I would love to tell you how we were prepared to meet the challenges, but the response, the very, I think candid response would be that we cannot tell what's coming up. We do know from the previous Trump administration, which was one of the most challenging times for us as an organization. I will say that we monitor 145 countries, and we have staff all over the world, and most of the time, as we're doing that work globally, United States is obviously not the country that we're too worried about, or is somewhere I mean, there are still problems. Like right now, there's a case going on against a journalist who in Oregon who was targeted by the what is it, the brothers, the right-wing group. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Um,
The brothers, I'm forgetting their name. Good. They really trolled us, but like you have some really disturbing trends in the United States that have always been there, mostly coming from the right wing when it comes to, misinformation that has been growing, obviously COVID-19, was not a great time for journalists, but that kind of opened this Pandora's box of misinformation and disinformation campaigns and created some new trends that did not exist. In the United States. And I think that a lot of the right wing in the US and a lot of the conservative, a lot of, journalists, institutions and people who do not like journalists in the United States have adopted and learned and taken inspiration from other dictatorial governments and countries. So we've seen some trends in the US, but compared to the last outgoing administration, what we are looking ahead in the new incoming administration is really hard to tell. We know that there's going to be a lot of misinformation. We're going to have to battle a lot of that. We know that there's going to be a lot of smear campaigns that are very intertwined with misinformation. I must also mention that in our press freedom monitoring, we have 55 categories in how women and LGBTQ journalists get targeted. And a lot of these categories do not exist for, if you may, other monitoring of press freedom attacks, because this attacks against women and LGBTQ journalists are very specific sometimes, that are only specific to gender and race. So we know that we're going to probably see a spike in those categories as well, because the incoming administration is not very friendly to gender and racial diversity. So we know that we are preparing in those, specific categories a little bit more than other categories. And then we just really have to wait and watch and see what's happening. We obviously have plans of improvising in terms of our peer support work, seeing what we can do for journalists on a one-on-one capacity. I will say that it is going to be a very, very, very busy time, and it's going to be a time where we are expecting that every month or quarter we will be improvising, and then see where things go. We might be doing a lot of learning during this time as well.
I think that's pretty accurate. I think that we are in, for many people, right? We're in uncharted territory, right? As a country. And your organization, right? What strikes me about it, right? And certainly because of your background, right? You're a journalist with so much experience, right? Reporting just on peace and security, right? You've been in conflict zones, and at the same time, you've also been an educator. You've shared, so much of your experience with fellow journalists and with students. So I would love to know, despite all these challenges, right? Despite the rockiness that we can expect moving forward, because that's a given, it's a given at this point, and any member of the press knows that. What is it that keeps you going, Kiran? What is it that keeps you going when you wake up in the morning and you see, everything that you've done and everything that you want to do?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I will say I'll go back to something we talked about, resilience. I mean, in the previous conversation we just had briefly. I think that journalists really, because I spent 20 years doing this. I mean, I started doing journalism when I was 16. And I think that, and my last bit, I'm gonna put the sun down a little bit. It's shining on my face. Not that that's a bad thing, but is it better? Oh my God, it's still the same. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I think journalists can be very resilient people. And it's really, it's not something we don't often know that. I don't think I knew that before I studied neuroscience. After I got, after, I had, my series of panic attacks, actually, it's been almost a decade. I kind of took a break and went into study neuroscience because I wanted to understand the brain, and that kind of really opened a lot of information about, how we are also human beings. Journalists, we don't often think we're humans because we are like so service oriented. We're here to do the job, and we are objective witnesses. We have to, so we kind of in a way learn how to put ourselves in the background because that's what the job requires, and that's how we do the job well, is to put ourselves in the background. But what's happening in that process is that we are putting this sense of purpose in the foreground constantly. Every time a journalist goes out there and covers a difficult story where you are, working hard to be an objective person in very difficult circumstances, like conflicts kind of bring out more because it's physical. There's a lot of physical action in a war zone. There's a lot of physical witness, seeing humans physically get impacted. So it's a little bit more visceral. But I think that journalists are always in that situation. You could be covering education, you could be covering corruption, you could be covering technology, you could be covering sports, and you could be in the same situation where in your objectivity, you're trying to prioritize your sense of service to the public. And when you do that, what really happens is that you become more resilient. And I think that most journalists, especially after having spent a couple of years in journalism and then choosing to stick around, and so I am the same as all of us, is that, I think I became resilient. And at some point that, after 2 decades, that probably became very detrimental to my health, which made me collapse. But I think that is why I do what I do now, is to make sure that we can intervene during that process and be able to support, journalists who are, women and LGBTQ, but also journalists who are from the very vulnerable backgrounds who do not get access to resources, because I think we can intervene during that process before that breakdown happens. But how do I keep going is essentially just a human ability that I have, as we all do, is to keep going, as long as we know what our choices are, which I think for most journalists is to be able to serve the public with information as fairly as possible.
I think that that's a very good point. I think it's been said that a journalist's first responsibility is to their citizens, right? To the public at large. And I think also as we embark on this very turbulent, on this very turbulent chapter in U.S. history, I think that many journalists are now reflecting, right, on issues of not just, of course, right, on how these issues impact the public, but now for the first time, many journalists in the United States are thinking about how they have to approach matters regarding their own safety, right? Their own safety, their own mental health, their own well-being. It's remarkably difficult, and I feel that in some ways, the culture can just teach us, oh, just compartmentalize it, right? Your duty is to just go out there and and just grab the story and send it out. But I would argue that that would only compromise, reporting. Well, what do you have to say about that, Kiran?
Yeah,
Could
I
you
think
share?
that's fine. I mean, I think that we don't, you're right. If we could, we're in 2025, and I think it's a good time that we've had the Me Too, and we've had Black Lives Matter, and have had all these, so we can more openly discuss the issue with colonialism and how that sort of shaped our journalism culture, which was this, the white middle-aged man going around the world. In a way, if you look at that culture of journalism that was like supposed to be objective in the face of, violence, and that journalists were supposed to report on things without getting impacted, was so unrealistic that most journalists suffer. Most journalists go through PTSD, which is not something that we were culturally talking about until just a couple of years ago. I think journalists have some of the worst PTSD amongst all of the professions, just in line with soldiers and veterans. And then why not? Because journalists do end up wanting to bottle up a lot of their emotion of empathy and compassion and engagement, of human connection, which is intrinsic to this job. So if you were a journalist who were kind of not doing, and I said colonialism because I think that started with, sorry, I'm gonna have to deal with this right now. Oh, there you are. Now you can see me. Um, I think that culture was a very, culture at the time where, after World War II, as journalism was kind of become booming as an industry, not only in the West, but also all over the world, is during that time. It's post World War II when journalism kind of boomed as an industry. And I think that during that time, what we thought journalism was objective, we kind of stripped it of its essence, which was human connection, understanding of what you are supposed to do as a witness, which I think now we can see more of. I think that a lot of, especially journalists of color, have diversified that kind of reporting, especially foreign journalists like you're a co-founder of the Foreign Press Correspondents Association. And thank you, kudos for doing that. I'm sorry, I forgot to say that in the beginning. Like, really kudos for doing that, because when I was a foreign correspondent, in the United States, there was no association for us. So, like, good job on that. And I think that, I think so, particularly that community, the immigrant community, the foreign correspondence community that comes from different parts of the world, is the one actually really making a difference in telling nuanced stories and coming up with nuanced ideas of telling the real stories of the people. And that all goes back into how we used to think what journalism was versus what it's supposed to be. And I'm glad that we are kind of changing that all together.
We are. I think that we're seeing there's been a paradigm shift, right? Slowly and steadily over time. But I think that your point about how we are how do I put this? The last few years in particular, right? The last decade, we've seen this pushback, right, against these colonial narratives, right? These colonial narratives. And these narratives have largely defined, right? They've defined the experiences of more marginalized communities, right? Who have been forced to adapt, right? To, and I think you hinted at this a little bit in your answer just now, forced to adapt to this hustle culture, right? This hustle culture of just like, oh yeah, go out there and do this. But that in itself, right, comes from a very specific place that doesn't necessarily take into account the experience of of these journalists, of these people who are in these marginalized communities. It doesn't tell us anything about their experiences on the ground, right? It doesn't give us that insight. In fact, it hinders their ability to share that with us. And could you just tell me a little bit more about, with this in mind, right? Um, just what is it then, right, that you would say that the average person, or maybe people even people in our field, what don't they understand about marginalized communities, or like, for example, in this case, women, women journalists? What is it that they need in order to do their jobs effectively? What is it that has been lacking?
I think that this understanding, that's a great question. And the understanding that we have, that we know everything, despite of the fact that we are in the industry of curiosity, that journalism is all about curiosity, that I think that journalists institutionally, sometimes within our own industry, we somehow think we know everything. And that also comes from the colonial mindset, unfortunately, because that's like you kind of have already determined what is important to us, how we are going to cover the world, what are going to be the issues it's happening right now. Donald Trump just got elected, but and it's still happening right now, that we are still determining that we know everything and we know how we're going to cover it. Oh, and this is how we're going to solve these problems. Like, you're seeing the conversations on DEI and all of that, like, that's going on right now. Not on, I mean, of course, like a lot of tech, a lot of corporation, but similar in journalism, we've tried to solve some of our problems so pretentiously that we haven't really gotten down to really solving them. And why is that? It's because, despite of the fact that we are in the curiosity industry, we tend to forget to ask questions and to wonder about how we're supposed to, behave, How, what are we supposed to understand? So, one of the major challenges that we face, I will tell you, despite of the fact that everyone knows in 2025 that women journalists are targeted, and that there's sexualized violence against women journalists, and that when they are taken to prison, that there's a sexualized connotation that is used by prosecutors, when they're going through trial, when they're taken to prison, they are more likely to get sexually abused, etc. Everyone knows that. And we still, I think people still want to know, like, it seems like they don't really understand that women, LGBTQ journalists from different racial backgrounds do have different dynamics of increased and very nuanced violence against them. And somehow we just don't understand, and we have to repeat that. And why is that? Because in the curiosity industry, we are not curious enough. And I think that's the problem.
I think I really do. I like the term curiosity industry, and I think that it's well. I find that that term interesting because there's this idea that journalism has abandoned its original principle, right? Many, for example, I would say with the recent election, and certainly in 2020, and certainly in 2016, there's been a backlash against, against the media. Of course, we've seen, attacks against fake news, etc. But many people feel that journalism doesn't represent them anymore, and that this is an elite profession, right? That it's an elite profession that represents elite interests. So I would love to know, given the fact that you have so much experience, especially on the ground, right? You have all this experience on the ground, working, for example, in conflict zones, right? How do you see us forging a path forward that can help people really reconnect with and help journalists, right? Like reconnect, right, with this original principle, right? That we represent the people that are in front of us and tell their stories.
Mm, mm, mm. I think that you know, speaking of, being on the ground, I will say anywhere in, whether it's the United States, or it's anywhere else in the world, Mexico, Latin America, like Middle East, everywhere throughout my career, one thing that was consistent is that um, I felt like, as a journalist myself, that people had a lot of hope for journalists because they looked at journalists and often thought these people have the mic, these people have the communication tool to communicate our problems to the world. And yet, at the same time, there was almost simultaneously always, and I mention all of these different landscapes in different countries because these are very different parts of the world, and somehow people's experiences are very similar, that despite of the fact that people had a lot of hope from journalists, they also were very disappointed in the media because they don't feel heard, they don't feel seen. And that is something that I feel I've always felt throughout my career, and I still feel that I don't think we ask ourselves that enough, ourselves individually. And when we do, I mean, a lot of journalists I know, actually, especially the ones that we cover in our press freedom work, majority of these journalists are in trouble because they are doing the job. They're doing the real work. And then the challenge there comes in that journalists were trying to change that problem that you are just asking about. Very important problem. The disconnection between the public and the journalists and the media is essentially the trust that public has. And so the journalists who are trying to change that dynamic are the journalists who actually end up getting in trouble and going to prison and get assaulted and get, there's misinformation campaigns against them and because they're trying to serve the public and they're creating someone else who would attack them because of doing that. And these are, so unfortunately, coming to the point is that we don't have resources for these journalists to feel protected and do their job. So, are we creating that environment as an industry to protect journalists who are trying to deliver on that, rebuilding the trust with the public? The answer is largely no, even though there are a few $1 million, roaming around right now in the West, I mean, in the United States, particularly to fix journalism and improve ecosystem of local journalism, all that stuff. That is not enough because we need to invest so much more. I think from our understanding as someone, as an organization that focuses on press freedom and support and peer support of women and LGBTQ journalists who are the biggest targets of all of these campaigns. And I think that also most because women, LGBTQ journalists, and journalists who come from racial backgrounds are the ones who are most connected to the very stories that we need to tell right now about the world. They're connected to the immigrant communities. They're connected to the communities that are from racial backgrounds who are the first targets of any kind of inequalities. So these journalists are the most targeted and they need more protection. And I can say that we don't have 80% of the coverage for them, on the ground. And I think that means that 80% it is likely that we are going to create more mistrust in the media, which is unfortunate and a huge waste of resource of all the journalists who are resilient and who want to deliver.
It's safe to say that there are going to be some very difficult choices that are going to need to be made, right? And questions, very serious questions that need to be considered in order for our field, right? Our colleagues, us, right? You, right? As a leader of a very important organization that will, that will face threats, in a more politically charged, environment, such as the one that we're living in right now. And
Yeah, we already are.
yeah, yeah,
We
yeah.
are using it in the last year and a half. It's been crazy
It's
with
been
all of
crazy.
going on that are divisive, even in America. Like we have faced a lot of problems in the last, I mean, since COVID-19, but I think the last 1.5 year has been very difficult to do protection and advocacy for women and LGBTQ as much as that is something that we think that is what the industry is on board with. There isn't enough protection for journalists and for organizations doing this work.
There isn't, sadly. And I think that as we close this out, I think that you've made some very remarkable and very salient points that I think that all journalists need to consider if they want to be properly equipped, right, to report, right, to report moving forward, while taking their well, certainly taking their, their personal safety into account, right? But they also need to take into account, right, as has been the general theme, right, that we've explored the last few minutes. They do need to take into account the stories of the people who continue to be overlooked, and it is astonishing that they continue to be overlooked when so many of them hold so many of the answers to the questions that we are trying to answer, right? We are going through a reckoning as a society, and this reckoning will redefine the meaning, of journalism for us as members of the media, and certainly for members of the public. So I suppose in closing, Karan, what would you say? What would you say to your fellow journalists and to the public right now, right? Like how can we all keep the faith as we move forward and as we continue to engage in the very important advocacy work, for example, that you and I do. We're two peas in a pod, right? Just on different sides of the coin. So what would you recommend in this respect?
I think that to be realistic, I think that we have to come out of all the things that we think that, hope, for example, is an intangible thing. And I think that we need to come out of that and really get into action. I think it cannot happen without everyone acting. And I think a lot of times just Having conversations is not enough. I think that doing actual tangible things is absolutely important. So, what we can say is working with community and, for journal, I mean, and it's not easy for journalists to like bridge that. It's not an individual's job to fix the system. However, what you can do as an individual is gather people, bring people together who are going to be willing to join you and who have the same, this is an interesting time. I mean, you said you used the word reckoning, and I would say that, yeah, we are in a time of reckoning, but also we're it's time out. It's going to go so fast that I've seen it in other countries. I've seen it in countries where, really strong democracies have disintegrated literally within 5 years. That and having very good ecosystems, having very good civil society as well. Sometimes we think that we've got it covered, but we don't right now. If you look at the speed of things, it's going really fast. And so I think that there is a reckoning, but let's do something with that reckoning in action instead of just thinking, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to sign these letters. I will tell you, when we started the organization, one of the things that I was like, we're never going to be an organization that's going to do advocacy with writing letters and getting 200 and 2,000 or whatever million signatories, because those letters don't help anymore. So understanding what the time needs right now from us is more than being signatories on letters and all of that. We need to get into action. We need to work with people who are allies, who care about democracy, because press freedom, protection of journalists, protection of civil society, which is what we do as well in our work, is about democracy. You would not journalism is a pillar of democracy. Free media is a pillar of democracy, and we need to understand that we do have to work together and work with allies and come together to be able to do actionable work on a daily basis, and not be like, oh, it's going to be a letter that I'll sign and I'll feel meaningful. I think that's so 20th century. We're in the 21st century, new challenges, new ways of acting on things.
I I just want to thank you for speaking with me today and sharing all of that, because I do think that you're right. We need to redefine, we need to redefine everything. And in fact, strip it down to the essence, and restart and recharge. That is the moment. And I think what you have established is that, yes, there are many problems. And in fact, and well, we've both touched upon this, but journalists have often, because of many different circumstances, right? And because of the culture, they've gotten in their own way. And while we are our own problem, we are also our own solution. We just need people to really, really understand that. And I think that your organization, to say nothing of, your background and the experience that you bring to leading it, really, really understands what we need to do moving forward. So thank you so much, Kiran.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, just one more thing I want to say, like
Sure.
everything that we talked about today, I will say, and it goes back into the neuroscience part of my understanding of things. I think that it's not like anyone's doing anything deliberately. I don't think that we're overlooking things deliberately. I think that we are all human beings, and at the end, before we are journalists, or even people who attack us, they're actually at the end of the day human beings. And so to understand that this is all something, this is to learn better about how our brains and ourselves can align better with our values and with our missions is important. I think journalists oftentimes don't realize that they do have a mission, because we kind of stay away from wanting to have that activism background or anything. But we are kind of in a time where, journalism is about public service, and really that's what it is in its essence. And to remember that as a mission, and to realize that, constantly question ourselves, like, how can we do this better? I use the note on curiosity industry, and that's really to question everything, to question how can we do this better. It is not to defy how we do things. It's not to shame how we do things. Absolutely not, because we don't deserve any shame. We are all trying to do, we all mean well, but I think that as human beings, the way our brains are designed, we tend to overlook if you're not in a state of curiosity. So to rekindle that state of curiosity could really help, in also helping us getting back into action.
I think that that is a fantastic point to end on, and I hope that whoever is watching us today, please, please listen to Karan. She has wonderful insights here, and I would certainly love to collaborate further and learn even more. So thank you, Kiran. I really have much respect for you and for your experience and just the opportunity to get to know more about you and to learn about the wonderful initiatives that you're involved in today. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.